Well, welcome everyone for this Agrarian seminar. We're kicking off the new sort of series of seminars this year, and we're very lucky to have Tomaz here, who will, of course, explore China's motives and dynamics in terms of investments in Brazil in the agricultural sector. You probably know this, but let me just highlight that Tomaz is a lecturer in the University of York. He holds a PhD in development studies from SOAS and a master's degree in history from Peking University. He has spent several years in China. He's fluent in Chinese. It seems right. That's what I understand. So he will have insights of what is going on in terms of Chinese capitals and state policy as well with regards with agricultural investments. So thank you, Tomaz, for kicking this off. He will have like 45 minutes and up to an hour for the presentation, and afterwards we should have a Q&A. People joining online, also please feel free to participate actively in the Q&A session. So yeah, that's it. The floor is yours, Tomaz.
Thank you. Should I be holding this?
I think it's fine.
Yes, right?
You leave it there, yes.
Okay, I'll be counting my time. Yeah, as Enrique was saying, I come from Brazil and I've lived for several years in China. So my interest about China was to see the connections between China and my own country, right? The most important link between these two is agricultural trade and investments. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to study this topic. But of course, there's plenty of literature talking about this issue, mostly from Brazil, analyzing Chinese investments there. And literature, when I started to do my research, literature was very advanced. Was already saying that investments were varied and they changed over time according to local contingencies and so on. And my interest was to see, okay, so what are the dynamics inside China that would explain all these changes in the way China engages with agribusiness in Brazil. And back then, my goal was to take this as a case to actually understand how Chinese states operates, as in how these agribusiness firms, they managed to go abroad, but they managed to go abroad have been incentivized by the states, and what companies were going abroad, what companies weren't able to do so, and how their international expansion would influence state policies inside China. So this was a way for me to try and understand the Chinese state itself. Today, I'm going to set this debate aside. We are not going to be discussing the state. We are not going to be discussing emerging capitalist class fractions, which was one of the main topics of my discussion. Instead, I'm just going to be looking at agribusiness, these companies, why they go abroad, what is the constituency inside China that let them do that. So, wait. So in this presentation, I'll start explaining a bit how food security works in China. And how food security policies influence the internationalization of global funds. And then I'll be looking at a specific case of soybeans, which has been an exception of how soybeans have been liberalized and have been, and through its liberalization, firms have been trying to go abroad. And this has brought many contradictory effects in China. And the third part of my presentation, I'll be dialoguing with the different literature of Chinese investment, analyzing Chinese investments in Brazil, and I'm gonna try to make the link, the connection between what these people have been saying and what we could add to this literature by understanding what are the complexities of what's going on in China as these companies go abroad. So starting with the food security debate, as Zhang Xiaohua, his name, he's a prominent prominent scholar that analyzes this issue. He starts by saying that, of course, as we well know, Western powers have been externalizing the costs of labor reproduction, sorry. Traditionally, they have been doing so through colonialism and unequal trade. And this is a way for them to guarantee enough food and feed supply for the reproduction of capitalism and industrialization in their own countries. Whereas China, there are many evidences that would be showing that can show that China has been having a growing demand for food. And this is connected to urbanization, industrialization, the rise of middle class, and that would prove that China has been following the same path. Also, China facing a shortage of land and labor would also means that we can now see our food on the production prices, which would suggest that China has to go abroad following the same path of Western countries. However, it's important to know that the path of colonialism and equal trade deals is not as easy to be reproduced as history has shown, and therefore China does have an interest in maintaining a certain rate of self-sufficiency. So imports have been rising for sure. However, there's a still high rate of self-sufficiency, which means that China still has to rely on its own supply in order to stabilize for social stability, and also to guarantee enough domestic, to guarantee the needs for the domestic demand. Food security, though, has changed over time, right? It can be traced back from the Maoist period, starting in 1949, where China was facing increasing US embargo, geopolitical conflicts with the USSR and the US, and food self-sufficiency played an important role. And this was done through modernization of agriculture, mainly through collectivization. Nowadays, since the mid-1990s, where throughout the reform and opening up, there we could see agricultural stagnation and food shortages affecting the domestic market. Food security started to become an important issue again. And it started to be an important issue that had to meet the rising urban meat consumption. However, this time, instead of collectivization agenda, food security would be met through capitalist imperatives of growth. And this was especially so after 2004, when we have the so-called end of the urban bias. By that, I mean a process of capitalist accumulation in the countryside that combines capitalist accumulation either from below or from above. From below, I mean the differentiation of farmers, small farmers, whereas ones would grow over the others, would be hiring labor, would be expanding land, and this we can see happening in China according to the literature, with connections with the state, promoted by the state. At the same time, we have capitalist accumulation from above, whereas we have the venture of external companies, the so-called dragon-head enterprises, agribusiness companies venturing into the rural economy through vertical integration, by connecting different segments of production, from trade to processing to agricultural production. And of course, this has brought commodification of lands through the leasing of land ownership rights, the transfers of land ownership rights, the rights to use the land through leasing, whereas now we have almost more than 1/3 of land being already displaced and shifted to the hands of large agribusiness. So then we can see food security coming together with a new form of capitalist accumulation in the countryside. So when we see the the Chinese internationalization attempts to guarantee food supplies from foreign markets, we can see this as a way combined with modernization through capitalist imperatives that are mostly led by large agribusiness, but also following political strategic imperatives for food security to maintain a stable and large amount of food supply that would be meeting the demands of the domestic market. And some authors would argue that this is what we call as a new mercantilist approach, which is a territorialized approach of companies going abroad to guarantee stable foods, to guarantee the control of food and food supply and stable pricing. New mercantilism would suggest that the commercial capital is the most important element here, where wealth depends on the trade control and surpluses. Therefore, through a new mercantilist approach, China has been able to develop by importing raw materials and agricultural products on the one hand, and on the other hand, can also guarantee competitiveness by protecting its own industry through exchange rate control, regulatory certification, export subsidies. This has been a way that literature has understood Chinese agribusiness internationalization through an illiberal market rule, which means that China has been challenging Western monopolies with a state-driven agenda, with the back of the state. And therefore, by challenging this monopoly, it has shifted the trade flows from north to south, from north-south to east-south, connecting, therefore, Chinese market with Brazil and other agricultural exporting countries. And therefore, of course, meeting the food security agenda of stabilizing domestic economy amid ongoing food crisis in the neoliberal global order. All right, but the case of soybean brings some caveats to the discussion. That's because soybean has a very early liberalization. China opened its soybean trade markets very soon, and already in the mid-1990s, was pushing for liberalization agendas, the agenda that was meeting the WTO negotiations in order that soybean was being used as a trade-off for China to access global trade benefits. And back then, soybean liberalization was seen as a solution to grain shortages. In this case, we can see that food security was reshaped. So the idea of food security was shaped, whereas before self-sufficiency was the most important thing for every single crop. Now feed ingredients, feed crops were allowed to be outsourced in order to meet its food security. And that's because staple grains were being privileged, were being highlighted as the most important thing for China's self-sufficiency. And soybean then was, and soybean is a flex crop, right? So soybean is a feed ingredient, is a feed crop. With soybean, after being crushed, soybean can become a feed ingredient, and the soybean meal that comes out of this crushing process can be used, added with corn, can be used for animal feed. But soybean is also used as a direct human consumption, which tofu, soybean oil, soybean meal. So it's a pretty important crop that has been traditionally used in China. Throughout the meatification of Chinese diet with high protein intakes, this feed crop became important, and it was therefore liberalized for this to attain this demand, to meet this demand. However, with the liberalization of soybean, we can see a huge increase of imports that came along with a stagnation of local production in a way that has been unprecedented. And with the stagnation of local production, because these producers could not compete with foreign imports, the processors, the soybean processors, the crushing industry, they started to move to coastal regions in order to have better access to soybean imports. And this has also benefited the North Atlantic large agribusiness that had an easy venue to enter China by exporting soybeans from South America and investing in China as well. So we can see here that after the liberalization in the mid-90s, we have a huge spike in global imports, in Chinese imports of soybeans, whereas the soybean production internally has stagnated. At the same time, this was the most important, it was the biggest soybean processors, and they were growing, but they were growing, establishing more and more plants, processing plants in the coastal regions. These two companies, they went bankrupt 2 years after this, which means that the soybean industry in China became pretty vulnerable to global price fluctuations because of their huge reliance on imports. So, soybean, this specific sector, became went into the middle of a very contradictory political struggle inside China. On the one hand, this feed crop was more and more controlled by the so-called ABCD, the large agribusiness enterprises, North American mostly. Its pricing were all started to be set in the Chicago futures auction exchange market outside China, and therefore was very vulnerable to price fluctuations that would affect the Chinese market. And a few countries would be concentrating most of the production and exports, like Brazil, the United States, Argentina. But on the other hand, China still has its food security agenda that for a long time still targeted soybeans as 90% of self-sufficiency aims. So it means that the government was still trying to promote internal production following food security policies. And also the government was imposing barriers to soybean processing. So import barriers to soybean meal. So it would protect its own processing industry by not allowing soybean meal to be imported. It would only allow the raw soybean to be imported to China. And also, it was also prohibiting the use of transgenic soy, the GM soy, for direct human consumption, therefore protecting its own national market. That in China they could only grow non-GM soy, whereas for imports they can still import GM soy that is directed for to feed production, whereas in China the non-GM soybean is directed to human consumption. So in between these two very conflicting stances, we can see the growth of different companies in China, different forms of agribusiness expansion in China, many large agribusiness that have evolved and expanded through different ways, mostly sometimes even contradictory ways of expanding. And as they expanded, some of them were more connected to foreign markets, some of them were more connected to domestic market, and they had different agendas, and therefore they were influencing and being influenced by the states. And each moment of these, since the soybean market was liberalized, each moment we have the prominence of a group of enterprises that were somehow imposing their agenda or benefiting from certain state policies at that time. We're not going to be talking about this state-market relationship, but it's important to know that this controversy within the soybean sector also affected the way Chinese agribusiness was expanded abroad. And we can see three main phases of expansion. So the first phase is this early phase, where as soybean was liberalized, even before the Chinese state started to promote and to give huge incentives, financial incentives to its companies to go abroad, even before that, we can already see COFCO and ChinaTex, two big companies. They were state traders. They had most of the control of imports and exports in China. These two companies started to go to Brazil. And according to the literature, we can see the way they went to Brazil, despite being controlled by the states, they were pretty flexible, and they were adapting their investment strategies in Brazil to different individual actions of government officials, business professionals, and other trade actors, which means that there is a diffusion effect, which means that there is a contingency effect that was shaping the way these companies were already investing in Brazil. And as an evidence of this, we can see that these two companies, they were trying to make deals with government officials in Brazil to acquire land, which is the case of COFCO. And the case of ChinaTex was trying to make deals with local cooperatives from the south of Brazil. But none of these attempts were successful, mostly because back then, the large agribusiness, the Western agribusiness, which were already very powerful in Brazil, they were imposing financial barriers to the Brazilian suppliers that were making deals with the Chinese counterparts. So they were sort of boycotting these suppliers and denying access to certain services and trade. But as COFCO and ChinaTex were state traders, it was still interesting for the ABCD, for the large Western agribusiness corporations, to make deals with ChinaTex and COFCO, because therefore they could consolidate the trade monopoly in Brazil by exporting soybeans to COFCO and ChinaTex that back then were controlling most of China's imports. And this happened to actually favor these two companies. In the mid-2000s, the soybean sector in China, as it was very vulnerable to price fluctuations, as it was reliant more and more on imports, during food price crisis, there were two huge peaks in food prices that affected the domestic economy, and most of the domestic processors and producers went mostly bankrupted, or they were refinancialized by the ABCD, who were acquiring firms in China. Amid these huge price fluctuations that had hit hard the Chinese domestic market, COFCO and ChinaTex were actually benefiting from it, because they were making trade deals with the foreign counterparts, and they were starting to develop derivatives and futures business with somehow the help and the knowledge they acquired from this partnership with foreign enterprises. So this time we can see that, and this was made not only with trade agreements, but it was made through the exchange of directors. COFCO was sending directors to Wilmer and ADM and vice versa. And they were doing joint ventures in China by investing together in China. not only in soybean processing, but also in other business sectors, such as securities and insurance. Coca-Cola, for example, came to China with a joint venture with COFCO, chocolate companies, and other companies from abroad. They were introduced to China through these joint ventures. And now we can see that while the domestic processes, soybean processes, were going bankrupt, with the exception of Tomaz, this company here, COFCO was somehow rising with more ADM, and China Tex suddenly became the third biggest soybean processor in China. These two companies started to have huge profits. So COFCO almost eightfolded its profits from 2003 to 2009, and China Tex grew a lot as well. So this is a case where we can see that foreign investments, agribusiness internationalization, and their Chinese footprint in Brazil has a direct connection with what's going on in China, in a way that we cannot understand why the Chinese agribusiness in Brazil didn't succeed, as the literature has been trying to say, without actually understanding what was going on in China. And it is the case that with this huge reshuffle of business reshuffle in the soybean sector in China, there was a backlash from Beidahong and Sinopec that were responsible for storage and farming in China. And these were one local and one central SOE, state-owned enterprise, that were pretty keen in maintaining the supply and the stability of prices and the soybean production and processing in China, according to food security concerns. However, at this time, we can see food security already changing its meaning from something that was only about self-sufficiency and modernization in China to something that started to be following the lines of Sino-foreign dichotomy, in which it would be important to maintain self-sufficiency, to maintain food security. It would be important to guarantee domestic ownership against foreign ownership. So this is a moment where we can see in the discourses that food security started to come along with this nationalist idea against foreign ownership. And after a huge struggle between these different companies and their related state segments that involved semi-official institutions that were being formed with broad alliances, you can see at the newspaper back then that there was a huge discussion that involved the Ministry of Agriculture. After this, we can see through this, by utilizing this new sense of food security against foreign ownership, we can see that there was a huge political change that was actually against the interests of foreign enterprises and their partners, COFCO and China Tex, and the Chinese state traders. Chinese state traders that back then, because of this, started to suffer huge loss. So by this, we can understand what the literature means that Chinese investments went abroad and didn't succeed. Indeed, they didn't. Look at this. China Tex had 45, almost 50% of its revenue through soybean trade in Brazil, with Brazil mostly, and it drops to almost zero afterwards. And this was because of the political changes back then. For example, the prohibition of GM soybeans as food ingredients in China that would create this exclusive market for domestic processors. Also, it would specialize and would allow them to specialize in non-GM soybean products. And the expansion of national soybean reserves that were controlled and managed by Sinograin. And this was a way to stabilize prices. Also, the creation of a joint procurement mechanism that would allow different companies to purchase soybean together instead of only relying on these Chinese state traders. And therefore, Chinese state traders wouldn't be able to manipulate and set prices according to their own interests. Also, the establishment of new subsidies through which the state would purchase soybeans at a minimum price and therefore would control prices and allow the continuation of soybean production. Also, the subsidies were given to domestic processors that would be buying soybeans from domestic farmers. This was the first phase of Chinese investments in Brazil. And as a result of this first phase, we can see the fall of these attempts of China Tax and COFCO. And instead, we can see more incentives, as I was saying, from the Chinese government for companies to guarantee the domestic ownership by investing abroad. So more incentives. By this time, there were more incentives for Chinese companies to go and invest abroad to control a bit more of the international trade, but also incentives for companies to be importing soybeans from China. What we have in the literature now is the debate about land grabbing. At this time, in the after 2008, there was a huge debate about Chinese companies going to Brazil, going to South America, mainly with the aim of purchasing, of acquiring land. And this was indeed what happened with many companies. However, they did not necessarily acquire any land. They were just making exaggerated claims, as the literature says. These exaggerated claims of land acquisition of new companies, not anymore COFCO, not China Tax, these were companies that were put at the side, and new companies such as Beidahong, which is the one who was pushing against COFCO and China Tax on the first phase. This company was one of the most important ones. And Chongqing Grains and other companies also, with the support of Sinograin, the company that was against this, they started to go abroad and have somehow exaggerated claims for land acquisition, exactly because they were following this idea of food security that was in line with this Sino-foreign dichotomy, this discourse. And therefore they had exaggerated claims, so then they could come back to China saying, look how much land I have acquired and how much supply I can guarantee for the domestic market for food security concerns, right? And these claims, first of all, they did not necessarily come along with advanced and adapted local operation. They were more political oriented. So these companies could get more financial incentives when they come back to China saying they have these claims. They could have financial incentives to go and go abroad again. Or politically speaking, these executives could go back and escalate in the party ranks. And not by chance, these investments also didn't succeed, right? But also, they didn't succeed because of political hostility in Brazil. Because of these exaggerated claims, the Chinese companies started to become to be on the spot, and media, politicians using the anti-China discourse. They helped approving, which was for the good for sure. They helped approving laws restricting foreign farmland acquisitions in Brazil and in Argentina. All right. But this is going to be just a business descriptive explanation that I'm going to give. But we can see that Chinese unsuccessful attempts abroad are directly connected to the political situation, context in China. And we cannot explain the Chinese failure abroad without understanding this. And the internal dynamics of food security agenda just happened that Sino grain started to have a more important role in China. So it was stockpiling more than 10% of soybeans in order to control price and supply, right? Second shift in the political context was that China was keen in diversifying its imports, soybean imports from North America to Brazil and its neighboring countries. But the most important thing, and the third thing, is that there was a huge financial incentives from the government to allow private companies to acquire soybean, to import soybean from China in order to avoid foreign ownership and push for domestic ownership over trade. And these companies, they were incentivized to purchase soybeans through this thing called letters of credit, which they take money from the bank and they can repay the bank after soybean imports were completed. Therefore, they had like a couple of months with this money without needing to pay the supplier directly. And it just happens that this credit boom allowed these companies to actually reinvest this money in more lucrative sectors. So these companies were getting money from with letters of credit to buy soybeans. So they were purchasing soybeans from abroad, from Brazil. And with this money, they were investing in the real estate, microcredit, and other investments that were booming in China. And therefore, they were importing more and more soybeans in order to acquire, in order to get more credit, in order to reinvest in other sectors. What happened? It was a bubble, of course. So we can see that soybean imports skyrocketed from 2010 to 2014, and at the same time, soybean prices in China was going into a downfall. Of course, this has lowered the supply costs, benefiting domestic processes that rely on raw soybean. And however, this was not benefiting traders, these companies that were investing in Brazil. Why would you invest in Brazil? To sell very cheap soybeans that don't make any profit, where there are companies here that are importing cheap soybeans, and they are making profit anyway through other means. But also, even these companies that were making profit through other means, there is a point in a bubble that whenever credits becomes less numerous, and whenever the states, the real estate market or the other investment markets become less profitable, they also come to a crisis, right? And this just happened to be the case of Sunrise, China's most important soybean importer at that time. So its trade income was rising because it was buying more and more soybeans, but its profits was lowering. And after 2013, Sunrise, which was the biggest importer, just went bankrupt. Beidahong, in turn, which was that company, the state-owned company that was investing in Brazil, it was moving its processing plants from inner China to coastal provinces more and more because it was easier to import soybeans at a cheaper price. But at the same time, the decline in production within China, because this soybean production in China was competing with cheaper imports, was hitting Beidahong's own businesses. In a way that we can see, for example, here, imports were rising, but the state where Beidahong has most of its soybean production was decreasing its production levels in Heilongjiang, and the national soybean production was decreasing. Whereas processing plants that were relying on imports kept some profits in this time. Domestic processing plants that were relying on domestic production had huge losses. The Beidahong subsidiary, the one who is specialized in soybean processing, was relying less and less on the domestic production But at the same time, its own main company, Beidahong, its main company, was having less and less agricultural sales, mostly soybeans. So it was having less and less soybean sales, and its total profits were somehow decreasing also because of this. This is the internal logics that explain why Chinese unsuccessful attempts to invest and guarantee food supply from Brazil is not only related to land grabbing issue, but it's related to a shift in political context that allowed more and more companies, in order to meet food security concerns through this domestic ownership frenzy, to take more control over trade, and therefore create this bubble that ended up with the failure of Chinese international attempts. And the last phase of Chinese investments in Brazil, which is also related to new discussions about Chinese investments that have many links with the domestic context, is the new phase after 2013, mainly after Xi Jinping took power. We have, after the failure of this bubble that busted in the late 2010s, the state started to have a more prominent role in incentivizing companies to have a more comprehensive agenda of globalization. And this was in line, of course, with Chinese attempts to gain more prominent power globally, right? And with this more prominent role, we can see the state support of COFCO coming into play again with a so-called more than market strategy. So this is what the literature talks about: Chinese companies going abroad and buying soybeans and whatever other crops, paying above market prices in order to expand, also following the lines of the domestic market needs, food security, and so on and so forth. But in this case, the international expansion of Chinese agribusiness came with a more globalized attempt, as I was saying, in a way that the domestic market had served as a springboard for COFCO to go global. Now, the domestic market, with all its food security concerns, it might not be anymore the main agenda, the main interest of Chinese agribusiness, because it might just be a springboard through which COFCO can go global and gain competitiveness in the global market, because COFCO has grown through the domestic market. It imports from the domestic market. It has a huge economic leverage, but therefore it can expand its industrial capacity to Brazil. So it has been moving processing plants to Brazil, and also has been selling more and more soybeans outside China to all these countries, not only in China. Therefore, we have a more globalized constituency. Mainly, and this came into play mainly with the acquisition of huge agribusiness companies, the Noble Agri and the Dutch-based Nidera. Through all these mergers and acquisitions, we have a company that is way more globalized than we have seen before. So this is a state-backed strategic approach, of course. But again, we can see one more time a type of investment that has its flexible approach, flexible strategies that can adapt to local know-how, as COFCO acquired Noble Agri and Nidera and maintains most of its processing of its operation and management in Brazil. So it didn't change the personnel, and it was somehow mimicking the practices of Western agribusinesses. And one of the most important aspects of this new strategy is that COFCO somehow learned how to mimic not only the production and processing and trading, but also integrate itself into global financial markets by also mimicking the financial mechanisms used by these foreign agribusinesses. And this meets the ownership of COFCO that is, I mean, COFCO has its ownership that is so different from its internal competitors. It's mostly based on offshore firms because it has been a state trader. And through this foreign ownership capacity, COFCO has been able to move its own companies to remote locations, through to tax havens, and to benefit from more flexible flow of capital in the tax havens. COFCO International, which is the company that acquired Noble Agri and Indera, is actually a multinational investment platform that brings together other financial investors. And COFCO borrows money from foreign banks, issuing short-term commercial papers. It has been growing its derivatives businesses. It has been listing most of its company in Hong Kong stock exchanges. And COFCO has been benefiting more and more from price speculation mechanisms through trades. So its profits from futures margin, from futures operations, future hedges have been growing, whereas the revenues, the income it gains from foods manufacturing and sales has been decreasing. But this is I'm going to the conclusion. But this is a form of agribusiness that is globalized and it's integrated into global financial markets and it benefits from global financial markets. But this is not only, this doesn't came by chance. Actually, this is also related to an internal political dispute in which COFCO benefited, in which the companies that were investing through these so-called land grabbings, as they failed in Brazil, COFCO took the position as the main bets of the Chinese state. And now we can see this state council prioritizing COFCO's mergers and acquisitions over its own competitors, instead of Sinograin being the one who will be merging and acquiring other domestic firms. COFCO has been the chosen one now. During the anti-corruption campaign of Xi Jinping, we can see that actually Beida Huang, a chief executive, and its soybean subsidiary, the chief executive of its soybean subsidiary, went to prison during the anti-corruption campaign. We can see the state attempts to assign COFCO senior executives in its competing firms. So they are, since 2013, COFCO's executives have been assigned to Sinograin, to lead Sinograin, and to adapt Sinograin to its own business model. And we can see a rise in subsidies. So before, whereas Beida Huang and these others, following food security concerns and so on, during this time, COFCO was having less and less state subsidies. Now it has had more and more. Not by chance, COFCO, which was kind of the same size or even a bit less important than Sinograin, started to grow over Sinograin and Beida Huang. Not by chance, COFCO became the first soybean processor in China, whereas the other mostly stagnated. And now we can see Chinese agribusiness through this financial integration as a form of expansion, agribusiness expansion, that has been able to leverage from global financial markets by attracting foreign financiers, attracting money, capital, attracting credit, investors to its own projects, and creating somehow an alternative to Western agribusiness by playing its same game. With the rise of COFCO, we can see a political shift in China that is somehow according. So by the time that COFCO was expanding its futures business abroad and in China, the state launched its insurance and futures pilot program, allowing insurance companies and other financial institutions to start to venture into China's domestic futures market. Also, the target price-based direct subsidies that were approved back then to protect farmers from price fluctuations, they were abolished. And now we can have the voluntary formation of soybean selling prices, which favors futures hedging and COFCO's financial speculative strategy. We also have the development of GM seeds, whereas before GM soybean was used as a way to secure a market niche for these domestic processes. Now we have the development of GM soybean seeds in order to create an alternative pole, global pole in China, where Chinese companies, globalized Chinese companies with this huge financial leverage can compete with its Western counterparts by mimicking the practices and bringing them back to China. So China becomes, as Chinese state-owned companies go abroad and compete in foreign markets, they also allow foreign markets to come into China and compete with them, therefore creating an alternative pole, financialized pole, that operates pretty much in line with neoliberal practices to reproduce itself within China. And of course, the nationalists, there's also, of course, we can see still somehow a nationalist discourse that allows boosting and protecting somehow and is encouraging the domestic production that somehow follows still some sort of food security concern in China. Well, wrapping up, this is just a way to say that so far the literature has been very advanced, and we have a lot of knowledge about what happens with Chinese investments abroad. But we can only have the broader picture by understanding what was happening through the historical shifts, the historical changes in the political context in China. The first phase, we can see partnerships between Chinese state traders, COFCO and China tax, with these Western companies, but they prompted responses from Chinese SOEs that were favoring food security agendas against these international attempts. The second phase, we have a politically driven approach that somehow failed. But this failure is also explained by the credit boom that was happening in China. And the third attempt, we can see COFCO's finance-driven expansion in China going towards a deeper integration into global trade and financial markets. Thank you.
I'm just coming here so that people online can also see me. Thank you, Tomaz, for that. It's a very rich analysis of agribusiness, Chinese agribusiness capital, composition, strategies, and also the links with policy in China, state policy. Hugely interesting. We do have time for a proper Q&A. Perhaps I can kick this off with a couple of questions while people prepare their own questions. And of course, those joining online, feel free also to use the chat box or raise your hands electronically, and we can take your questions as well. The first one is kind of a puzzle. At some point, you mentioned that in China, there's been this specialization in non-GM soybean production, right? But then if you're producing non-GM, that entails kind of more labor demand, right? Because if you're not using herbicides, then you need more people to do the weeding, for example. But you also mentioned that China struggles with labor supply. So it's kind of this puzzle. Why is it that you would go for a strategy that would require more labor if that is one of the problems that you're having? If you could say something about that, that's one thing. And the other one is just to invite you to expand a little on the Brazilian context. You did a very rich analysis of how the political context in China shift and influence strategies of corporations. And you did mention that corporations go to Brazil and they do shape their strategies. But I was wondering if you could expand that, because in the second phase that you mentioned, it just got my attention. It was 2003. So we're talking about Lula getting into power. So shifting political context. I was wondering if that's a relevant thing to discuss. Yes, so perhaps we could start with that one, and please feel free to start preparing your questions for the next rounds. Is that okay?
Yeah.
You can take it from here, please.
Yeah, very interesting questions. I mean, so yeah, GM soybeans require less, are less labor intensive, right? But we can see that Heilongjiang, which is the most the leader of soybean production in China, has been very keen in protecting Chinese soybean production against soybean imports, which are GM crops. So they have been prohibiting GM production in Heilongjiang. They have been, since 2016, they have been prohibiting the processing firms to acquire GM soybeans. So no processing firms in Heilongjiang can acquire GM soybeans. And this is just related to an interest from a local interest that is connected to its own economic agenda from the province, which is the province of Beidao. So I think, yes, of course, in the discourse of pushing forward the GM or non-GM soybean crop, I think there is this element of labor. There's also the element of health, right? Because since the mid-2000s crisis that affected the sector, there has been a huge backlash from the media and these semi-official entities that were emphasizing the how unhealthy GM soybean can be. And so all these things are components of the debates, but mostly it is a political and an economic debate that involves different interests within the Chinese state. Central government wants something, mostly because of the influence of its own related agribusiness companies like COFCO, whereas Heilongjiang, which is the most important soybean producer that has Beidao, it doesn't want that. And it's still being a struggle, right? Well, the Brazilian context, when COFCO went to Brazil, first time, it made a deal to acquire land, and it made a deal with the Brazilian Lula government. And back then, the backlash that these companies faced from China, they were also, they came along with media campaign against the Lula, against the Labor Working Party governments in Brazil. So it is directly connected. During Bolsonaro government, of course, the far right, the last far right government that we had in Brazil, COFCO was already the leading company, along with Syngenta, that was purchased, was acquired by Chinese state-owned ChemChina. These two companies are the biggest ones in Brazil, Chinese companies that operate in agribusiness in Brazil, right? But now Syngenta, people might not even know that it's from China. COFCO has its land plots, but it doesn't rely necessarily on its own supply, because it just operates by mimicking other foreign agribusinesses, which have contracts, supplying contracts with local producers, and therefore they don't have to have their hands dirty by supplying directly and purchasing land and going through deforestation and so on. So during Bolsonaro governments, Chinese companies were already way less propagandistic, way less politically oriented. It was the case of COFCO. Now, yeah, I will stop you. Yeah.
Thank you, Tomaz. Okay, now we can open the floor. Please raise your hands if you have any questions here in the room, that we can take others in the chat as well. Anyone? Yes, Jack, we could try this. In theory, it should work. Let's see. I mean, we have to wait a little. It was a bit risky. That's why I didn't do it at the beginning. We have to wait until it gets green. There it's green. What can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering what trends you've seen most recently in terms of the post-COVID slowdown of the Chinese economy. Talking about first bubbles in terms of the implosion of the property market in China. How has that started to affect these global trends?
Great, thank you. Anybody else like to take it?
Thanks. So very interesting But also, in a sense, it feels to me as if you only scratched the surface in the presentation. There's so many questions I would love you to talk more to. So I'll fire some of them at you, and we'll see how much you can cover. So I'm not quite sure if I understand the way COFCO works. Is it really simply as other big multinational companies in this field, or do they, for example, get government support directly? Or so would you say that for the producers it doesn't really matter whether it's the one or the other, because you say they've created different bowl. How much is it different bowl, and how much is it just so one that instead of having 4 big, you know, 5 big, and they're all the same really. So some thinking of be interested to know your thinking about how different this is. Does it change the way local agribusinesses work in this sector, or is it just the same? And so similarly with the outcomes in Brazil, is it same as the others? Does it matter for deforestation in Brazil? Does it matter for this extreme growth in soybeans production in Brazil? That there's a big Chinese player in there. Has it changed anything? Has it changed anything? The way it's done, the amount of it that's done, etc. Yeah, those. Let me stop there, because it would also be interesting to know what it has, the impact back home, whether what we have now, back in China, is simply free market will monopolies, or whether it still feels as if the states are more etc. There.
Thank you very much. I think we can take one more. If there's yes.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. It's really interesting. What do you think? I know that you work in a focus on state market relations, to make that clear. But I'm interested what you think this tells us, and you also told us about calculations within China, particularly within the ruling class, which I think is that term. State senior political figures, senior state and enterprise figures, senior corporate figures. How does this work? Is it a geographical aspect of it? Or is or other types?
Okay.
Okay, Thomas, let's go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, this has helped to move the discussion a bit more, a bit less descriptive, right? Because, because the main goal here is to
be closer.
Yeah. The main goal here is to dialogue. For me, was to dialogue with the literature about Chinese investments in Brazil, and to fill up the gap, and by explaining what happens in China was somehow a way of doing that. This relates to new discussions of what's going on in China in the post-COVID economic slowdown, the crisis of the real estate market, and of course we can see a slowdown of import demand, declining profit rates in soybean processors, which is somehow linked to agribusiness attempts to move processing plants outside China, which is somehow linked to this tendency of export of capital, seeking larger markets abroad and cheaper labor abroad, or more accessible land abroad. And this tells a lot about the responses of Chinese agribusiness, at least in the soybean sector, the large agribusiness, to meet the challenges of the declining profit rates in China. It's a new form of expansion that is way more comprehensive, right? For the government support, what does it mean? I mean, I think there are different discussions. One is how these different forms of agribusiness investments, how do they affect farmers, agriculture itself? What does this have to do with agriculture? What is the impact? So this is one discussion. Following this discussion, we can see that actually larger attempts to push forward derivatives markets, to open China's derivatives markets through liberalizing the exchanges of GM crops in the diamond for exchange, for example, and also by pushing this futures plus security agenda and COFCO's growth in China through its own mechanisms of prices. It has its own retail platforms. There is a challenge to local producers because in the soybean sector, local producers are still small ones that have been vulnerable to import competition. And I do believe that this is a new challenge that would not resolve the problem of soybean production, will not resolve the problem of either social stability in Heilongjiang, and therefore we see the Heilongjiang government trying to make a way to maintain its domestic ownership and protect, revitalize the production of soybeans there in the province. As for agricultural producers, farmers in Brazil, of course, they do benefit somehow from COFCO's expansion, mainly through this modern market strategy. So it has been related that, of course, they can sell more soybeans at a higher price just because there's higher competition in the market. So then they have some short-term benefits from this. As for, so of course, this is one aspect of the discussion. The other aspect could be also related to the environmental impacts. Environmental impacts in Brazil, this might be related to a future question, but of course we can see the same attempt to reproduce the business methods of Western companies, COFCO trying to do somehow the same, and COFCO has actually championed, has mastered the way of expanding with somehow environmental, with an environmental agenda. So the green agribusiness COFCO has been pushing for is basically what the other companies have been doing, which is basically since 2017, COFCO has been tracing, or at least saying that is tracing its soybean supplies from Brazil to areas that are not related to deforestation. And therefore, to do this and other so-called environmental sustainability practices, it has acquired the biggest loan ever an agribusiness company has acquired with foreign banks. So COFCO has had just now a year ago got 3 billion. I might be lying. It's from 1 to 3 billion. It's billion dollars loan to do this green financing strategy. With this money, of course, so the question is, how can a Chinese state company acquire such a huge money and attract so many foreign investors, so many banks from London to New York to Singapore to its own green finance agenda? And it's been mastering. It's the company who got most money from this. So then comes the third aspect of the discussion. What does this tell about Chinese capital going abroad? And what is the role of the state? And I think it's twofold, right? So on the one hand, the state has been more and more prominent in the West. Neoliberalism is still the most important agenda, but it's backed by the state. Companies, corporations have to incorporate security concerns and have been boosted by the state through credit loans to increase its competitiveness, to advance with developments of new technologies in agribusiness also, and to operate by increasing productivity and everything. In agribusiness, this is also true. On the other hand, a company that is directly backed by the state has been having an opposite tendency of being more and more diffused, right? So it's on the West, we have the state coming into play more and more prominently, whereas in China it's the opposite. but this is a way of, this is still a story of state-led internationalization. It's still a story of a state that has its own food security concerns, that has to have somehow, even with the promotion of foods, of futures markets, with trade speculation, even with the single company benefiting from price fluctuations somehow in the global market, applying the same techniques in China, it has to have some sort of compliance with social cohesion, right? And therefore, it has to have some sort of nationalist agenda, either because of its own business and economic interests of being a global player and competing with foreign agribusiness as a newcomer. It has to have the state, but also the state has to maintain itself through social cohesion. Otherwise, the state cannot maintain itself. So this is still a story of a newcomer that is backed by the state and has its own internal concerns. But it's a story, it's kind of a successful story, because I'm not saying, I mean, COFCO is the 5th largest soybean exporter from Brazil. So it's not the biggest one. I'm just saying that this is the biggest Chinese company that operates in Brazil. But it is successful because it's a story that we can see the state leveraging its power to attract private, private support. So it's a story, it's again another story of the state attracting private interests, right? And managing to locate itself, to place itself in a favorable position in the global market through neoliberal practices. So it's a way of the state positioning itself in a competitive and favorable condition. And it can only do that with the support of the state. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to do that. For now, that's what I can think of. There's also the question that team has raised, right? So what does this tell about the disputes within China, right?
You might have answered it a little bit already, but yeah.
Yeah. This was the main topic of what I tried to study in my PhD thesis, right? So it involves huge disputes in a way that financialization cannot be seen as a technical solution. Financialization in China happened as there was a huge credit boom that after 2008 with China's new Keynesian response to the crisis, but capital, so therefore capital was able to develop rentier strategies, and COFCO is just one example of that. But this is a rentier strategy. This is a strategy that is more financialized, that contrasts with the other interests, and therefore we have a huge dispute. And this is also a story, a way of saying that as this new strategy that is more financialized, as it goes abroad, it comes back to China, increasing the disputes within China. So amplifying so we can see that as China goes abroad, it amplifies its own disputes, which is somehow connected with the idea that we have of the so-called unequal and combined development of these new capitalist economies that integrate themselves into the world economy, but they don't integrate in an even way. And we have some that are more linked to the global market, and others that are so-called more domestic oriented or have a more backward economic composition. And this means that unequal and combined development through China's integration into the global economy just means that the disputes will be more and more intense because it is unequal and combined. That's the story.
All right. Thanks, Tomaz. We now have a round of people joining online. I know there's a question by Giselle Ferraz. You're welcome to open your mic, and if you can, for some reason, it's fine. We can read the question. But Giselle, would you like to to ask your question. You can open your mic now if possible.
I think Giselle dropped out of the call.
All right. Okay. So Amod, please
Yeah,
can
but the question was, she was asking like, do you see the same pattern on other agri products such as dairy and meat, and not only in commodities, since there is a dependency on Brazilian exports of these products for human feeding in China?
Okay, perfect. So that's one. The second one is by Monica Piccini. I think Monica, if you would like to open your mic.
Yes, hi. Can you
Yeah.
hear?
Yes, clearly. Go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. It's been very, very enlightening. And basically, I just wanted to ask, I know it's not part of your presentation, but it goes along in parallel with soya production, you know, as it expands, and also for biofuels productions. That's, you know, something that's been going on in Brazil. Last week, they increased the mix in the fuel. What are your views on the expansion of infrastructure projects in Brazil, including, I mean, for instance, BR-319, Ferrogrão, and as part of a Belt and Road Initiative that Brazil is thinking of joining, and what are the environmental impacts of that? Because this is going to be huge, right? So that's you know, if you can answer that. I know it goes in parallel with your topic. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And one more from the chat, Marilia Luz. If you can open your mic. Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, Tomaz. Great to see you. Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, at some point you mentioned that, I'll just read what you wrote in your PowerPoint. It says, nationalist discourse on food security, including boosting China's soybean production and diversifying its global soybean supply and positioning itself against import dependency. So I was wondering, who is supporting the nationalist discourse on food security in China against dependency on imports? I mean, does this discourse come solely from the government, or are there other actors supporting this discourse? And does this pose a threat to Brazilian exports? Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay, Thomas, if you can take those, and I think it's likely we'll have time for one more round. So, Jens, you'll get more questions to get into this. It seems.
Yeah, I mean, growing imports is in favor of China's own soybean processes, so therefore they can locate themselves into higher value capturing, right? So they can locate themselves into activities that have higher value in the commodity chain, and also it corresponds to the interests of meat and feed production in China, right? Which are also have higher value compared to raw soybeans. So that's it. I mean, to control price and supply of raw soybeans is directly connected to the interests of its own food and feed industry and meat industry that follows the changes of Chinese diets and food consumption patterns towards higher protein intakes and higher sugar and fats diets. Okay, so why would someone advocate for import diversification, for less reliance on imports? Soybean is the only crop that is that relies so much on imports. It's an exception. It relies on imports from only 3 or 2 countries. The US is the second biggest provider. It was the first biggest provider. And it started to be less and less important because of what Chinese direct attempts to move away from US imports, mainly after the trade war with the trade disputes with Donald Trump. And but it's still important for Chinese companies, even COFCO, to diversify imports. So COFCO has been investing in Russia. It has invested in Ukraine before the war. But COFCO the agenda that you can see in COFCO's corporate reports and in the news that have interviews with COFCO's executives is that actually imports is beneficial. So it's very rare to see in COFCO's own reports a food security discourse. Mostly is pushing for higher liberalization, more higher integration with global supply markets, right? And but this is a difference. So from the state's agenda. Okay. What about the expansion of infrastructure projects in Brazil? Of course, we can see big attempts from the Chinese state to make deals with the Brazilian government. China has been trying to put Brazil into its own Belt and Road Initiative project. Brazil has been one of the fewer countries that had not joined the program. It has had talks with the Lula government for that, and it has a huge package of infrastructure projects that wants to be applying if Brazil joins the BRI. Brazil, the new development bank is led by Brazilian former president Dilma Rousseff, that is leading the development bank, which is part of the BRICS. So it is Brazil is very strategic for China, and China has been investing more and more on where it is welcomed, right? So China has been relying less and less on investments and trade with global north, and the investment and trade with global south, especially those who have agreements within BRICS or the BRI, have been gained a lot of importance. And Brazil, of course, Brazil is in the map of infrastructural projects in China. Okay, but these projects go back. Why would we be discussing this project in line with the themes we were bringing in before? So this is another case of the state being a prominent player in the economic expansion, either private or state-owned expansion in the world. Okay, but one thing that we have to see is that infrastructural projects in agriculture or other sectors, they are backed by the state, but they don't only bring a discussion about management. How much power can the state bring, and how different management and operations are if we have companies and projects and deals that are backed by the state. The state now is not only a way of China as a newcomer to grow globally and locate itself favorably in global markets. But with infrastructural projects, we can see the state coming into play as a way to secure a global ecosystem with infrastructure projects, with global economic network to create an ecosystem in which its own companies can thrive. It can be state or private companies. So by building infrastructure projects, you create a favorable economic and political environment, creating an ecosystem for Chinese owned companies to go and thrive. So it's a new form of global area, establishing areas of influence worldwide that is backed by the state, of course. So it's, after all, state-led infrastructural expansion of China is a question of power, and it's not too much a question of business strategies. It is a successful business strategy, but it involves a power project.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, let's just have perhaps one more round. So who else would like? Yeah, Shreya. So just gonna.
Yes, so much. I guess you explained so much already, but I think a few things that I just wanted you to say more on. So I think in response to Tim's question, you were saying that it kind of this kind of financialization and making of this financial pool leads to all kinds of disputes. Also back home and in China, and I was wondering if you could kind of explain a bit more about what sort of disputes, what forms does it take? Is it kind of is it kind of, with other sections of capital or with other parts of the state, with other sectors of the economy? I don't know if you could kind of flesh out a bit more, what are these disputes or maybe forms of competition, or is there any space for competition at all? Or can we just say that COFCO is so successful, it's kind of like a monopoly now? I don't know if that's, if you go as far as to say that. So I guess that's what I'm trying to understand, what kinds of competitions and contradictions with other forms of capital, but also the state, it kind of gives rise to, or within the state. Yeah, I think that's all. And like maybe, it seems to me at different points you've kind of suggested that there is some difference with the state. So it's kind of saying import, in public statements it says that actually imports are good for the country, which is a difference from the state position. But then, does that have any implication for anything, or it doesn't matter to the Chinese state? Yeah, I don't know, to explain a bit that.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas, so much for the interesting presentation.
Thank you for coming from India, especially to this hall. After disappearing for 2 years, right? There is.
Anyway, so I joined the talk late, so maybe I'm kind of misunderstanding what you have presented before. But I kind of had a doubt while you were answering a question about the kind of diversification of COFCO inputs, and you said that it stopped relying on the US inputs a lot and then shifted its strategy to Latin America after Donald Trump. But Donald Trump came very late, and whatever charts that you were showing, they were from 2010. And so how you because you said mostly because of Donald Trump, so I was wondering, he came into the picture very late. So what was in the clarity? And
Could they one question more? Anybody else? Okay.
Okay, I can add one point, if that's okay. A more general question is, it's just, you mentioned in the last answer that there's like a political power, political project, power project behind it. And it's I'm not sure if it's gonna make sense, but it seems to me that with the issue of GM crops, for example, there's this rationale that health should be, in a sense, considered beyond a bit of cold economic terms, right? So that there is something more of it. I was wondering if Chinese expansion, the Chinese capital expansion in Latin America in particular, might take a different form because of this rationale that appears to transcend the pure economic calculation, right? That is, it's about building power, it's about influence, those sort of things. Because when you think about the Amazon, for example, now China is the main trading partner. So one big question that we try to understand is to what extent this might be different of, US capital expanding in Latin America. Do we have, I'm not sure hope is the right word, but would it be different somehow or not? Perhaps the dynamics of capital will be pretty similar to with US.
Yeah, I mean, Brazil has a strategic role for Chinese foreign diplomacy, right? And therefore, China invests. China is more flexible when it comes to leverage to bargaining power of Brazil, right? So, for example, Shein, the company, the online platforms retailer, was investing in Brazil, and it came with it had just established an agreement with Brazilian finance minister to move all its operations to Brazil, because therefore then Shein can pay taxes in Brazil. This is a move that clearly says that, okay, Chinese capital is willing to negotiate and to keep its influence, its economic advantages and prominence in Brazil. Maybe you wouldn't have done so if it was dealing with Philippines, for example, that has military disputes with China or with India, but it does so with Brazil. COFCO's ecological agenda, environmental agenda, is not very different from the others. That's my opinion. So actually, COFCO came after the others. I started to have these plans to have a full traceability of soybean supply after the other companies. Also because food security and environmental and sustainability agenda in China was coming together. The government in China has been pushing for this so-called sustainable farming in China, whatever it means, whereas feed crops, outsourcing feed crops, importing soybean was somehow outside this environmental agenda. So it was concerned with its own environmental sustainability in China, but when it comes to soybean imports, apparently China wasn't interested in pushing for any green economic project. But this has changed. And why has this changed? It is pretty much, in my opinion, connected to an economic strategy. It might have some connections with the sustainability diplomatic agenda in order to stop the encroachment of deforestation into Amazon regions in the north of Brazil, which is basically what's happening with the soybean expansion in Brazil. But it's mostly a way of COFCO to place itself favorably in this new frontier of capital accumulation, of expansion through green finance mechanisms that would entail tracing soybeans, advancing some sustainable practices and so on. What about the state? Okay, the divergences, the struggle that happens within the state. Of course, with COFCO goes abroad, it has more and more power, and when it comes back, we can see this reaction of government. This is the most visible way of reacting to COFCO's to this new way of agribusiness expansion. The debate on GM crops is something that we can see, okay, there is some contradiction within the states. Also, yeah, I mean, now what I can see for now is this, but throughout the history, we can trace, we can actually map different contradictions that are related to diverging different forms of capitalist expansion in the countryside. And COFCO and China tax just represent one way of expanding that has always been more connected to the global market, to financial capital, and therefore operates in a more speculative way than others. Beidahong, Sinograin are way more connected. They have a more endogenous way of accumulating that accumulation that is traditionally more connected to domestic production and consumption, to domestic circuits of capital. We also have private enterprises that have grown in a different way. These are mostly run by state officials that during the 1990s, they acquired their own assets while they were being privatized, and therefore they established their own companies. This is the so-called internal privatization, right? We also have these transnational networks of Chinese overseas, the diaspora. Wilmar International is the most important one. It is related to Kwok family, who lives in Malaysia and became one of the most prominent entrepreneurs in Malaysian agribusiness. And they are Chinese. They have Chinese background, and they started to invest in China. And they invested in China in a more with more transnationalized networks, operating with deals with local state officials. That's what I mean. I invite you to check out the story that goes with the narrative of the thesis that I wrote. It was all about how these companies, they expand in a different way, and then they struggle with each other by influencing the state to promote specific policies that are in favor of themselves, either by liberalizing more or less, pushing forward more financial liberalization or less, or I mean, different ways of expansion. It's an interesting story.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Unless there is one last burning question, I can see that Thomas is kind of exhausted now for good reasons. It's been
I guess you were exhausted.
comprehensive account of
2 hours of
expansion of agribusiness, Chinese agribusiness capital. Well, thank you everyone. So last two things to do before we close. The first one is just to invite people, if you're in London and people online, of course, we will have a hybrid event. So the next one is a launch of a special issue of the Journal of Agrarian Change. It will take place at SOAS, so very close by. It's been organized jointly with SOAS and Historical Materialism, and people can also join online. Special issue is on social reproduction of agrarian change, feminist political economy, and rural transformations in the global south. So please do join us for that one. And lastly, I just would like to thank the other co-organizers, Freya here, Amod and Carlos, and myself, by the way, I'm Enrique. I forgot to introduce anyone at the very beginning because it's been a very long day for everyone, but now we look forward to see you next time. That's it. Thank you again, Thomas.
Thank you for coming, everyone.